Hello and welcome to the Weekly Review, a program brought to you by the SSOMA network. I am Nyuol Tong, and I am this week's host.
And I'm Garang, your co-host for today's show.
Today we are fortunate and excited to have with us the Weekly Review's producer and SSOMA network Chief Correspondent, Roger Modi, who will be updating us about the news in the country and other concerns that South Sudanese are facing during this pandemic. Weekly Review is a program that we started recently. Its objective is to review news and concerns in the country of South Sudan and bring in experts to enlighten us and explain and analyze some of the concerns. You can learn more about what we do, about the network itself, but also about the Weekly Review on our website, SSOManetwork.org.
And so due to the ongoing crisis in South Sudan and around the world, the Weekly Review episodes will continue to focus on COVID-19 and the Revitalized Agreement on the resolution of conflict in South Sudan. Other relevant topics are also looked into from time to time.
Yeah, so welcome, Roger. Our first question, of course, as with our last episode, is informed largely by the pandemic and its impact on the South Sudanese people. So the first question I think that everybody's wondering about in South Sudan and abroad is what are the latest figures in South Sudan, both of new cases, but also deaths due to this pandemic?
Well, thank you, Nyuol and Garang. According to the latest figures released by the Ministry of Health on Sunday, the 7th, there are 1,604 confirmed COVID-19 cases in South Sudan. 15 people have so far recovered from the virus. The ministry says those who have recovered include the first Vice President, Dr. Riek Machar, his wife, the Minister of Defense, Angelina Teng, Minister of Justice, Madol Arol Kachol, the Minister of Information, Michael Lueth, the Minister of Environment, Joseph Napon, and the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Deng Dao Deng. 15 people have died from the pandemic, according to the ministry. So those are the figures we have as of Sunday, the 7th of June.
This is a very rapid acceleration because initially, 3 weeks ago, even South Sudan was one of the countries in the world with the fewer cases and also with almost 0 deaths. So it's something to think about and to wonder about what has occasioned this acceleration of cases, but also at the highest level of government. But that's a question for another day. In the interest of the public, there has been this issue that the Minister of Health, Elizabeth Achray, talked about and issued a statement about, including ordering the suspension of this peculiar thing, namely issuance of COVID-19 negative test certificates. It's a very strange phenomenon, and its development is interesting because we haven't heard of such certificates anywhere in the world. And so I think our audience and the public in general is very curious and would like to learn what is this all about, really?
Well, the Minister of Health issued that order suspending the issuance of COVID-19 negative test certificates after she said it came to the attention of her office that quote, some people, particularly around Juba International Airport, have been issuing fake COVID-19 test certificates, unquote. In the ministerial order, Elizabeth Achuai said it was in the best interest of protecting the public that she ordered for the suspension of issuing of COVID-19 negative test certificates until further notice. So it's a kind of temporary suspension, not permanent.
Yeah, but I think the question that I think is nagging a lot of South Sudanese people is, what is this certificate actually? Is it what is its purpose? So if you are issued COVID-19 negative test certificate, what does it mean? Because it reads as if it were a measure to evade testing, or there is some sort of concern that if you are like people who don't want to be hindered or limited in their mobility or their movement by the pandemic, the issuance seems to give them a pass, as it were, just go about or do things. So is it like an ID card you wear, like you have a certificate that you walk with and you take with you and you show to the authorities? So what is it like actually? So,
well, from the information we have been getting is that they've been using it for traveling. We're not so sure whether within the country mostly or also outside the country. But most of the people who are interested in that, those who travel. And in rare cases, some people told me that they were requested for that certificate, the places of work. So there was somebody who told me that, and another person also said that, and that the employers asked for COVID-19 negative test certificates.
So it is issued by the Minister of Health, and is it only at the Minister of Health or by any testing center?
There's a lot of contradiction there about the certificates. While the ministry is suspending, then the other day on Radio Miraya, one of the officials from the ministry was saying they're not even sure of how those certificates came about.
Yeah, it's a very, very strange phenomenon in the sense that, and this is what the health experts are actually saying. I could be negative today, right? But tomorrow I will get infected, right? So there's no value in really issuing this and saying that I'm COVID-19 free. But in the sense of the travel, I can see that. So for example, if somebody has to travel to another country, they get tested at the airport, at that point that they are traveling, it shows and it makes sense. But also it could lead to a lot of issues as people can, just use it and say, I'm free, and then they refuse to go for other testing or other. So that's really where the concern is. So let's see how that is going to go within the next few weeks. So that's something to keep in mind, and we follow and try to update our audience. And so maybe let me ask you about this. There's a concern about the people in the UNMIS camp, in the UN camp, because if we look at this phenomenon, the way it's happening is like if people live in more numbers, at the household, that's how really escalations happen, because you're getting infected, you are sharing utensils, you are sharing everything, and it's our culture. So this is really concerning, especially for people in the UNMIS camp. And so, as we know, they are really very crowded, overcrowded, and they're living in large numbers. So can you tell us a little bit about the number of people who are still seeking safety in the UN protected displacement camps that are also known as the protection of civilian sites in South Sudan? And what is the impact of COVID-19 on those POC sites?
Thank you, Garang. In South Sudan, there are 190,376 civilians and the protection of civilian sites as of the 20th of April 2020, according to the figures on UNMISS website. The POC sites, as many know, were established in 2013 at the start of the civil war, when civilians fled to the bases of the UNMISS to escape violence, some of which were ethnic violence. However, since the formation of the revitalized transitional government of national unity between the parties to the Revitalized Agreement in February, there have been increased calls from both the UNMISS and the South Sudanese authorities for residents to leave the POC sites and return to their homes. This call was repeated last month after 2 cases of COVID-19 emerged at the POC site in Juba. But even before that, in a media briefing in March, the head of UNMISS, David Shearer, said, quote, "We can now prioritize deploying peacekeepers to hotspot locations and areas where we expect thousands of displaced families to return to, rather than tying them down to static duties at protection sites," unquote. According to a piece published on Monday by researchers Joshua Grace and Naomi Pandel, the UN police officers, the UN police officers who managed crime in the POCs effectively stopped patrolling the sites on the 16th of May, that is last month. And since then, additional security issues have been reported in some camps. In Bentiu POC site, residents said the culprits of a recent killing took advantage of the UN police's absence to carry out the crime and, quote, escape without arrest, unquote, the researchers wrote. The researchers argued that with conflict around the country, clashes left at least 200 people dead last month in eastern Jonglei state, means POC sites residents don't feel safe going home, while others face returns to occupied properties or towns and villages still in ruins. So this is some of the information we have about the events going on at the POC sites in the country.
So based on what you just said, it seems there are about 6 POC sites that are being run by the UNMISS around the country. So do you have a sense of what the numbers of civilians out of the 190,376 people that you mentioned? Like, do you have a sense of what each of these 6 sites actually host? What is the total number? Or about the breakdown of each of the 6 centers?
Well, according to the figures I have, out of the 190,376 civilians seeking safety in the protection of civilian sites located at UNMISS bases, 118,385 are in Bentiu, while 27,928 in Malakal. There are also 29,659 in Juba UN base, that's in Juba UN house, and 1,921 in Bor, and finally 12,483 in the area adjacent to UNMISS in Wow. Just to look back at the month before they published the figures, that put the number to 190,376 civilians. In March, the number was a bit lower, and it was 187,942 civilians at the POC sites. So you can see that given that despite that there is peace agreement in place and people think things are moving on well, then still at the POC sites the number has been increasing according to the official figures from the UNMISS.
Yeah, and this increase also speaks to the sort of challenges that have been happening, especially in the countryside, since the peace agreement was signed, for instance. Violence in the countryside, intercommunal conflicts have increased, and these people, a lot of experts said this has to do with, for example, with the delay of the appointment of governors and the lawlessness that has spread. So this begs the question also, how has the implementation of the Revitalized Peace Agreement been impacted by COVID-19? And the figures that you give, I think, speak to that. So tell us more.
Well, let me answer this question with specific attention on the security arrangements enshrined in the Revitalized Agreement. And it is important to note that even long before COVID-19, there had been a lot of delays in the implementation of the Revitalized Peace Agreement, including in the security arrangements. And the forces of the various parties to the agreement were to be unified within the 9 months pre-transitional period that was stipulated in the September 2018 peace deal. The agreement provided that, quote, the training and redeployment of the necessary unified forces shall be completed within a period that shall not exceed 8 months, unquote. That, though, did not happen. Instead, the parties repeatedly extended the pre-transitional period, and when they agreed to form the unity government, which they did in February this year, they also agreed to allow key pre-transitional tasks of screening, training, and redeployment of at least 83,000 necessary unified forces to continue during the transitional period. However, that is still being met with delays up to now, including because of COVID-19. In a recent report covering the 1st of January to the 31st March 2020, the then interim chairperson of the peace monitors, that is the RJMEC, Ambassador Agustino Njoroge, said at least 78,500 personnel have been registered at the various cantonment sites, barracks, and training centers, and that in excess of 45,000 organized forces from both the government and opposition forces have reportedly moved from cantonment sites to training centers in preparation for unification training and subsequent redeployment. Last month, on the 6th, the Joint Defense Board, in its 12th ordinary meeting, resolved to graduate the necessary unified forces currently in the training centers within 1 month, beginning from the 7th of May 2020. However, just as the date they fixed for the graduation was approaching, in a meeting held on the 28th of May 2020, the Joint Defense Board resolved again that it was impractical for the graduation process to be effected without a budgetary allocation. Therefore, it was agreed that the graduation schedule will be revised when funds have been acquired. The Joint Transitional Security Committee and the Joint Military Ceasefire commission chairpersons and co-chairpersons have been tasked to follow up with the National Transitional Committee on the issue of funding for the implementation of the security arrangement according to the Joint Defense Board resolutions. However, last Wednesday, the IGAD Special Envoy for South Sudan, Ambassador Nyuol Wise, said training of forces has been halted to contain the spread of COVID-19, hence delaying the unification and deployment of forces. Further, Wise said the pandemic is threatening the well-being and lives of the forces who are assembled in cantonment and training sites. With a scenarios of this state of affairs, further diminishing the state's ability to establish presence and control over its territory and citizens. So basically that is the information and the facts we've gathered with regards to the question you asked.
Yeah, thank you so much, our producer and chief correspondent, Roger. And to you, our viewers, this is the weekly review, making sense of the news. It's a show brought to you by SSOMA Network. And we are going to go for a short break and we will be right back. Stay tuned.
Watching the weekly review, making sense of the news. Our episodes from now continue to focus on COVID-19 pandemic in South Sudan and the implementation of the South Sudan Revitalized Peace Agreement, as well as other relevant topics. I am Nyuol, your host for today.
And I'm Samuel Garang, your co-host. And we are being joined by our producer and chief correspondent, Roger. So
thank you.
Let's continue with our question. So before we went for the short break, Roger, you talked about the special envoy of IGAD for South Sudan, Ambassador Nyuol Wise. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Speaking about the effects of the COVID-19 on the training, unification, and deployment of forces, which are all part of the security arrangement provided in the Revitalized Peace Agreement that we just spoke about. What about on the reports of the ceasefire violations, especially there were clashes recently between the NAS, forces of General Thomas Cirillo, and SSPDF, which is the South Sudan Defense Forces, and the SPLM-IO. So what is IGAD actually saying about that?
The IGAD Special Envoy, Ambassador Nyuol Wise, said that the ceasefire is still mainly holding. So, however, he acknowledged that there had been reported clashes between non-signatory groups, those who did not sign the Revitalized Agreement, like the NAS, which is the National Salvation Front of General Thomas Cirillo on one side, and the SSPDF and SPLA-IO on another. Ambassador Wise made the remarks on June the 3rd while addressing a virtual meeting organized by the Open Society Initiative for Eastern Africa under the topic Rethinking the COVID-19 response in South Sudan. Last week, the NAS, that is the National Salvation Front, issued a statement accusing the SPLA-IO forces of carrying out, quote, summary execution of 15 innocent civilians in the villages of Loguni, Payumepayam, Morobo County in Central Equatorial State, unquote, on the 31st of May. The statement also claimed that on the 29th of May 2020, a combined force of SSPDF and SPLA-IO followed the civilians who escaped to Democratic Republic of Congo for safety In quote, they attacked and tortured the civilians in addition to looting the properties, the National Salvation Front claimed. The SPLA-IO responded that their forces were not involved in the alleged military offensive against the National Salvation Front. Meanwhile, my efforts to reach out to the spokesperson of the SSPDF to respond on these accusations have not been successful, but we will keep on trying to get their part of the story. On his part, the IGAD Special Envoy for South Sudan, Ambassador Ismail Wise, in the address that I talked about just recently, he said that due to movement restrictions as a result of COVID-19, the ceasefire monitors, that is the ceasefire and transitional security arrangements monitoring and verification mechanism, is facing challenges in timely monitoring and verification of reports of violations of the ceasefire and transitional security arrangements. He said, and I quote, with unification and deployment of forces delayed, and most of the forces confined in cantonment and training sites, and with COVID-19 related movement restrictions, errant armed groups are likely to be emboldened and continue posing security threats, unquote. I think I've answered what you asked entirely.
This is very enlightening, and it kind of brings us to the conclusion of our episode with this last question. In February this year, the government of South Sudan and the South Sudan Opposition Alliance signed the Rome Resolution on Monitoring and Verification of the 2017 Cessation of Hostilities Agreement. The resolution provides for representation of SSOMA into the ceasefire transitional security arrangements monitoring and verification mechanism structures, and for joint monitoring of compliance of the parties to the cessation of hostilities agreement. It's now almost 5 months since they signed the resolution in Rome. And we have to wonder, is the SSOMA now being represented in the ceasefire transitional security arrangements monitoring and verification mechanism structures as was agreed in Rome?
First, the SSOMA is popularly known as SOMA, that is the South Sudan Opposition Movement Alliance. And in the Rome resolution, it was agreed that the SOMA, which is made up of 6 opposition groups, including the National Salvation Front, NAS, which is also called NAS, and the South Sudan United Front, Stroke Army, that is headed by General Paul Malong, shall be represented in all ceasefire transitional security arrangements, monitoring and verification mechanism structures in equal numbers as the other warring parties. And just to be more clear, other warring parties referred to here those former warring parties who are now part of the unity government established under the Revitalized Peace Agreement. So the parties to the Revitalized Agreement, including the former IT-GONO, which is a former incumbent transitional government of national unity, endorsed the Rome resolution on the 21st February 2020 as required, and forwarded their recommendation to the IGAD Council of Ministers for its action. However, up to now, SOMA is not on the ground represented at the ceasefire transitional security arrangements, monitoring and verification mechanism structures. In an interview on Sunday the 7th, the spokesperson of the SUF-A, that is the South Sudan United Front, Army, Emmanuel Sande Dijon, who says he doubles as a member of the Leadership Council of SOMA, told me that, and I would prefer to quote, he said, I quote, SOMA has been represented in the ceasefire transitional security arrangements monitoring and verification mechanism in principle as per Rome resolution. This took long because it required approval by IGAD Council of Ministers, since the ceasefire transitional security arrangements monitoring verification mechanism is instrument of IGAD, and they did that in their virtual meeting of April 23rd, 2020. This led to the ceasefire transitional security arrangements monitoring verification mechanism chair writing to IGAD special envoy on SOMA inclusion into the mechanism, and who in turn wrote to community of St. Egidio, the mediators, to let us select the individual representatives to all levels of CTSAM VM, that is the ceasefire transitional security monitoring and verification mechanism, namely the board, technical committee, sectors, and monitoring and verification sites. SOMA is already selecting its members, about 15 in number, in accordance with the said resolution and in line with the cessation of hostilities agreement of December 2017, unquote. That is what Emmanuel Sunday Dijon said, as somebody talking on behalf of SOMA. And when I asked him when is the selection of SOMA representatives to the ceasefire transitional security arrangements monitoring and verification mechanism I expected to conclude, and how soon will SOMA start being practically on the ground as part of the ceasefire monitors, he said, I quote, as soon as possible, adding that it is the impact of coronavirus derailing the process. Just to conclude, giving you my answer to the question, actually, the IGAD Special Envoy, Ambassador Ismail Wise, also said something similar to what Emmanuel was saying about the implementation of the security arrangements. And that was in the remarks I just cited earlier, which was on the June the 3rd, while addressing the virtual meeting organized by the Open Society for Eastern Africa under the topic Rethinking the COVID-19 Response in South Sudan. And though Ambassador Ismail Wise was speaking about IGAD efforts in general, he said that mediation and peace efforts have been negatively affected by the pandemic, thereby adversely impacting on the peace and security situation in the region. The spread of COVID-19 has restricted the ability and mobility of IGAD mediations, parties, and stakeholders from actively participating in peace process, as it hampers the movements, Ambassador White said. So South Sudan and its peace process and the mechanisms established under the peace agreement for monitoring and all those are all part of this unfortunate situation. And indeed, perhaps the solution lies in rethinking the COVID-19 response in the country.
So with that, we have come to the end of our episode for today. Thank you very much for watching. And also thank you, our producer and chief correspondent of the Weekly Review, Roger Alfred Yoron Modi. This is still the second episode of the Weekly Review, making sense of the news. We are just getting started and putting things in order. In our coming episodes, we shall be bringing relevant guests to participate in the shows, if possible.
And we publish a new episode of the Weekly Review every Monday. Please follow SSOMA Network on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and our website, sosonetwork.org. to keep in touch with us and to learn about the previous episodes, but also the upcoming episodes. I am Nyuol, Tong, your host for today.
And I'm Samuel Garang, your co-host. Bye from all of us for now.